We are in a series talking about post-Easter living. What does it mean to be a community after Jesus' resurrection? What does that look like? And we're looking at the letters that we have from 1 John to kind of explore that a little bit further. They were a community that was influenced by people that were kind of wrestling with theology. There was false teachers, and so they were speaking to some of the things that was going on there. People that were communicating things differently. They didn't see Jesus the way they did, or maybe people who had never experienced Jesus. So we see some of that confusion going on in this letter. So I want to go ahead and take a look at this scripture that we have. It's 1 John 3, 1 through 7. See what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that they do not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now. That we will be, what we will be has not yet been revealed. What we do know is this: when he is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. And all who have hope in him purify themselves, just as he is pure. Everyone who commits sin is guilty of lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. You know that he was revealed to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has either known him or seen him. Little children, let no one deceive you. Everyone who does what is right is righteous, just as he is righteous. Some of this last conversation that we're seeing here about sin and lawlessness was part of the conversation around the Gnostics, the false teachers. They were talking about that your body could sin, but your mind could not, and they were speaking to that, saying that it's just all the same. So we're seeing some of that language around that, but I want to talk about two main themes that we hear in the scripture. One of them is the idea of being misunderstood, the other one being the theme of hope. So we have the scripture that we get about being misunderstood. It says, we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that they do not know him. Now, the thing about this scripture is it's vague in terms of who him is. Is he talking about God? Is he talking about Jesus? We don't really know. He goes back and forth, in fact, a little bit, but that's okay. We can take that to be a misunderstanding about God and Jesus, the community that we are called into. And we know that Jesus was misunderstood. We see this especially in Mark's gospel. Mark shows time and time again how Jesus' own people misunderstood him and even rejected him. So the author of John's letter is picking up on this theme. If they don't know him, they will not understand you. In their context, they're worried about the false teachers. These teachers are concerned about knowledge over faith, not being saved by faith, but by knowing something special. There was a lot of early theology that laid the basis for what we understand now, today, in our faith. So these letters help us understand what some of these teachings were about and what they were wrestling with at that time. But I also, in this scripture, I hear him saying, you don't have to make your faith or your dreams or your hopes smaller because they don't understand. And that message speaks for us today, too. You don't have to make your faith, your dreams, your hopes smaller because they don't understand. We don't need to limit. Live bold. Live big into being a child of God. When you are a child of God, it's not based on what you do. God has chosen you to be his child. Which leads to the question, have you felt misunderstood? Or where do you feel misunderstood? I think about Sunday mornings a lot when I think about this question. I know sometimes Sundays are hard. It's maybe your only day that you get to sleep in. Maybe it's your only day that you get a chance to rest or whatever that might look like. And I remember talking to families a while ago thinking about how hard it was to ask somebody to come to worship on a Sunday morning, to be a part of a community when maybe you work all week long. But recently, I just started thinking about that and reframing that as I experience those I know who are not part of our church community, and I can't imagine starting my week any other way. I can't imagine centering my life on sleeping in or centering my life on getting my grocery shopping done. I'm not sure what I would look like Monday if that's what brought me peace and got me ready. So I think about the gift of our community, the gift of walking alongside one another, the gift of encouraging and sharing our burdens, of being here together. And I don't think the world understands that until they've experienced that. I also think of the idea of an offering, of giving of our means financially, collectively, to support the ministries of the church in the world. And I don't know that the world understands that either. But this is the synergy of the church. This is how we come together to make the world a better place. This is how we follow Jesus, and it's sometimes misunderstood. I know those who have given up their time during spring break to do service projects around the church. These are misunderstood missions. And so the question we ask ourselves for our community, the question we ask ourselves in this series is, how shall we live? We purify in hope. That's our theme that we are talking about today. That's the story, that's the letter that we hear. But it's how shall we live? Not how shall I live. This is not our individual life after Jesus or with Jesus or following Jesus. This is not how I live. This is how shall we live? We plan for our own individual lives, but do we plan for our church community life? Are we planning as a follower of Christ? Are we planning as a collective community who follows Jesus in our world? Whether it was our world back then or our world today. Now, Jesus was misunderstood. What if we were a collective group of misunderstood people? I think about some of Jesus' most popular stories and teachings of times that he just confused people. He was radically unpredictable, and he had to clarify things. One that comes to mind is the story of the Good Samaritan we find in Luke 10. A Jewish man was attacked by bandits and left on the side of the road. The priest walks by, he does nothing. The temple assistant walks by, and he doesn't stop either. The despised Samaritan man comes along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him, and he stops and cares for him. Jesus asks, after teaching this, "Now which of these three would you say was the neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits?" The man he's speaking to replies, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus tells him, "Yes, now go and do the same." He's telling him, don't do what's expected. Don't do what's normal in the world, but do what's right by my teaching. We also hear the story of Jesus meeting the woman at the well, and he asks her for water. The Samaritan woman says to him, "You are a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews did not associate with Samaritans. We found out later that she has 5 husbands and has been cast aside by her community. She's been shamed. She's been judged. And yet Jesus invites her in. She was going to the well in the middle of the day because that's when nobody else would have gone. She did not want to encounter judgment. And she meets Jesus. And he speaks to her, and he welcomes her. And we know this. And this is the way that Jesus is misunderstood. His stories are unexpected. This is what it means to live a life that is not going to make sense. And John, the author, knows this. He assures the church that if others don't know Jesus, they certainly will not understand what you are doing. Do people today still wonder what we are doing if they don't know Jesus? Are they shocked by how we love those who have been cast out, that provide healing and safety to those who have been harmed and forgotten? What if we could boldly answer that yes? So these early Christians were trying to collectively live like children of God, like followers of Jesus, and we are too. 2,000 years later, what if we lived into this? not I, but collectively, as children of God, of followers of Jesus, it is our call, individually as a Christian, to cross that street and help the man that has been attacked. But what is our call collectively as a church? Now, maybe this is a story about violence and brutality, but maybe this is a metaphor. Maybe this is a metaphor for anybody who has been physically, emotionally, spiritually harmed, forgotten, and neglected. So as an individual, Jesus tells us the greatest commandment is to be a neighbor and cross that street regardless of if you don't like the person, if you don't think they're like you or do anything like you, still cross that street. That's what we're called to do. Our United Methodist Mission and Diversity Coordinator for the Indiana Conference, he challenges us that as an individual, we're called to cross the street, but as a church, what are we called to do? We are called to make those streets safe so that that never happens again. How do we prevent this from happening? What is the role of the collective, proactive Christian community in making all streets safe? What if the disciples then, what if all disciples now, today, lived into this mission of truly following him collectively, not individually crossing the streets, but making all streets safe? And then that woman at the well who was coming in the middle of the day would not have to come in the middle of the day. She would be in the midst of a community that's walking alongside her, that's loving her and supporting her. How shall we live? How shall we live? Now, the other theme that I want to talk about is hope. We have a line in the scripture that says, "We will be like him, for we will see him as he is. And all who have this hope in him purify themselves as he is pure." Hope brings purity. This is not saying that we are purifying ourselves, but that by God's grace we are purified by turning from sin and continually offering ourselves to him. Recently, I've met with a couple counselors, and I don't mean like individual counseling sessions. There's a special place for that, but and I value that, and that's a very important part. But I've had counselors who've come to me that wanted to speak about different things. And over the course of the past couple months, I've had 2 different individuals that have met with me. And it's a really hard field. There's a lot of burnout in that field. We are constantly hearing stories of frustration and lack of hope, or maybe the same problems going on and on again. And you can speak into it a little bit, but you can't really evoke a ton of change. It can be frustrating. It can be disheartening. It can be isolating too. And so I spoke to these individuals, 2 of them, 2 different ones that kind of shared very similar stories of being burnt out and discouraged. And my question to them was, where do you find hope? When you're stuck in this pattern, when you're doing the same thing over and over, and you're hearing the same stories and you're discouraged, where do you find hope? Where do you find hope when your own individual well runs dry? Now, just like I can't imagine anything different than my Sunday mornings here among you, I also can't imagine seeking a source of hope in a world without the light of Jesus in my life. If I didn't have that, I don't know where I would find hope. And so it hurts my heart to think of those who are trying to regenerate that hope on their own without that option. Now, when we talk about the light of Jesus, when we're recently talking about light, we had an eclipse, right? How many of you guys were down in the path of totality and saw the total darkness? Okay, we had a couple people. The rest of us were here, and it was 97% darkness. I expected a lot more from 97% darkness. Yes. 3% of light, and if Jesus is way more than 3% of light. So if we get our hope from Jesus, how much light is that? That's where that well is continually refilled. So as a collective community, we ask ourselves, how shall we live? We need a community to walk with us in this journey of purification, of improvement, of God transforming us to be holier. Not for the purpose, our community of the church and our community of Christians is not for the purpose of judgment or condemnation, but for the purpose of encouragement and building up. In Hebrews 10, it says, Let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. Let us think of ways to motivate one another, to do acts of good and love, and let us not neglect our meeting time together as some do, but encourage one another. That is what we are called to do as a community. How shall we live? We shall live together and encourage one another and purify one another through hope. That is why we are brought together in a body of believers, so that together we can become more like Christ. And that is what we are aiming towards as we purify ourselves in hope. The hope in a new identity, the hope in a new community with new relationships, and a hope of a new call to discipleship and all the power of the Spirit to guide us as we journey. Purify in hope. In hope we cling to what God is doing in us. No, I can't speak to this myself, but I came across something that I thought was interesting. I read an article and it said, sailors testify that surviving in the storm or trouble is not as difficult as surviving in the calm. I don't know if that's true, but I think about the metaphor of that for our faith, and I think that's often true. When you're in the storms of life, we hold deeply onto our faith. When things are really hard and things are really good, it's easy to be very faithful people, but what about the calm? What are you doing with your faith in the calm? They say sailors testify that surviving in the storm or trouble is not nearly as difficult as surviving in the calm. How are we surviving together in the calm? How shall we live when there is no storm? We are children of God. We are the community of the church. We are followers of Jesus, and we may be misunderstood. But let it be because we are extravagant in our love and our compassion. John is telling this church, his church, it matters not how high you jump, but how straight we walk. We live in a world that is trying to out-jump each other to the point that we're jumping all over each other. How straight can we walk? How can we support each other when there is no storm?